Hi everyone, welcome to today's program, U.S. Poet Laureate Natasha Trethewey in conversation with Leslie Harris. I'm Katie O'Reilly, programmer here at Chicago Humanities. This is one of many programs included in our Fall Festival this season, which features over 60 compelling conversations, powerful performances, and other events across the city. Bringing such conversations to life for you, our curious and committed audience, is our passion and what we've been doing now for 35 years. You're welcome to join us for a series of events happening later today, including Dr. Mayan Hillel on cultural entwinement, Barry Sonnenfeld on his career in Hollywood, as well as a conversation between authors John Green and Rebecca Mackay. And also please mark your calendars and join us for more program-packed days in the Lakeview and Hyde Park neighborhoods on November 2nd and November 9th. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to give special thanks to our presenting partners, Good Chaos, Friedman Properties, and the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, as well as our fall season sponsors, Wintrust and Southwest Airlines. This program is also presented in partnership with Northwestern University's Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. Finally, we'd like to thank our members and donors for their generosity. If you love what we do, please consider joining today by visiting chicagohumanities.org or stopping by the box office. Now a few words about our speakers. Natasha Trethewey served 2 terms as the 19th Poet Laureate for the United States from 2012 to 2014. She is the author of 5 collections of poetry, including Native Guard, for which she was awarded the 2007 Pulitzer Prize, a book of nonfiction, Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, the memoir Memorial Drive, and The House of Being, a meditation on writing. She is the 2017 recipient of the Heinz Award for Arts and Humanities, a Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets since 2019. Trethewey was awarded the 2020 Rebecca Johnson Bobbitt Prize in Poetry for Lifetime Achievement from the Library of Congress. Currently, she is a Board of Trustees Professor of English here at Northwestern University. Leslie Harris is a professor in the Department of History here at Northwestern, whose research includes slavery, gender, and sexuality in the antebellum U.S. South and the historiography of U.S. slavery. Her first book, In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863, led to her participation in as principal advisor in the New York Historical Society's 2005 groundbreaking exhibition, Slavery in New York. Harrison is currently working on a book on New Orleans that uses Hurricane Katrina and her family's history as a way to interrogate the history of African Americans in the city from the 19th century to the present. Please join me in welcoming Natasha Trethewey and Leslie Harris.
Hello there.
Hi. Thanks for coming out this morning. Natasha, thanks for being in conversation with me. It's always a pleasure. And thank you to the Chicago Humanities Center and to Northwestern's Buffett Institute. So as an historian, it's always a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to talk with Natasha, both in particular as with this work, The House of Being, this very beautiful book, and in general as a poet and a nonfiction writer who takes history seriously. And in all your work, I think, you reveal what it means. How do we live when we find ourselves as individuals and as a nation at the crossroads of history? How we live through those difficult moments when we'd rather really be anywhere else. And we're certainly at a crossroads right now, individually, nationally, and globally. One of the themes in this book that appealed to me in particular is your sense of responsibility as a writer to interrogate those moments, those really difficult historical crossroads, and also those who often get forgotten historical actors like the Black soldiers from the Civil War, forgotten events such as the cross burnings by the KKK that occurred near your home in both our lifetimes, which is kind of hard sometimes to imagine, and the people who our nation tries to forget. So as an historian, I really appreciate so much the way you recapture the things that historians study, and we write these big academic books and no one reads them, and you elevate them into such beauty. And part of that sense of responsibility, it seems from this book, came because of the people around you, your parents, your grandparents, but also, and this surprised me when I read the book for the first time, the World Book Encyclopedia, which I also grew up with, and I don't know if others in the audience grew up with the World Book Encyclopedia. And when I opened the book and I said, the World Book Encyclopedia? She's not only this incredible writer, she's my sister, my generational sister. So you began The House of Being with a chapter called World Book, and I would love for you to read from that chapter a little bit, and I think that will set us up for our conversation this morning.
Okay, great, thank you. The World Book. The first collection of books I ever encountered filled the shelves of the tall bookcase at the back of my grandmother's house. It stood just inside the doorway to the den, at the end of a long hallway. From floor to ceiling was an assortment of novels and plays, history, philosophy, and mythology from my parents' university years. A set of classic children's stories in several volumes, etiquette books, a group of pamphlets from the 50s about the proper dress and comportment of young ladies, an abridged dictionary, and the 20-volume World Book Encyclopedia, 1966. Bought for the year I was born, the set was meant to be commemorative, marking the beginning of my journey toward knowledge. My grandmother had purchased the set after nearly a year of saving the S&H green stamp she received with each purchase at the grocery store. There had been other gifts to choose from, I was told, including bronzed baby shoes or a set of creamy white dishes embellished with a border of pink roses and leaves, but my mother had insisted on the encyclopedia. That the story of the World Book's provenance was passed down to me from the beginning made it even more prized. I was enthralled with the title, the idea that a set of books could contain even a single year of the world beyond our house. The thought of what awaited me there ignited a longing that followed me, even into sleep, as I listened to my father's voice reciting a bedtime story, the myth of Odysseus and his many trials that I was certain my father had found among the pages in the many books on those shelves. Our nightly ritual of stories from classical mythology was only part of the means by which my father meant to reveal the world to me. To prepare me for it, and for the inevitable trials to come, he was determined that I have an early understanding of the metaphorical nature of language. During the day, the natural world served as our classroom. Most afternoons, we took long walks during which I'd pick flowers for my mother, and he would recite poetry. All along the way, he'd point out the flora and fauna we encountered, the vivid imagery inscribed in so many of the names: red-winged blackbird with its bright slash of feathers, mockingbird mimicking another bird's song, the word daisy, which he repeated again and again, altering it just so until I heard in the syllables of that single word two distinct ones, day's eye. He'd been holding the flower aloft, and suddenly I could see the way it mimicked the sun, each white petal a ray of light, the yellow disk at its center, our day's bright eye. I carry with me still a dream of that time, the earliest I can remember from my childhood. I am standing in the hall outside the room I share with my parents, my crib beneath the window next to their bed. It is night, and the house is so quiet, it seems that I am alone, or that everyone else is sleeping. The long hallway before me is a cave, tunneling through the darkness. The bookcase, I can just make it out, at its opposite end. And there, standing in the doorway, blocking it, is a figure the shape of a man, made entirely of the crushed oyster shells, white and sharp-edged, that formed the driveway beside our house. It's a familiar scene, archetypal in its imagery, which is why I think it has stayed with me. I must have been only 3 years old when I had the dream, and so the contents of all those books were as yet unavailable to me. What had the dream meant back then? It's a question I've been trying to answer ever since. Because the imagery of dreams is figurative, Metaphorical as all language is, it's easy to apply meaning over the course of one's life to make sense of not only the past, but also the present. I can't recall whether I had the dream on a night just after my father recited the story of Odysseus, the Cyclops, and the cave, but I can hear the echoes between them, how the hero of the story, on her quest, must get past the obstacle blocking her path to the world. When I think back on it now, I can see that all the stories my father told me, each with some form of the hero's journey, must have taken root in my psyche, establishing early on the pattern to which my own journey would conform. If the message I learned then from the experience of Odysseus was that it would take cleverness to outpace whatever obstacles stood before me, the meaning of the dream would deepen over the years as I came to see it as a metaphor rooted not only in the classical tradition of Greek mythology, but also a vernacular tradition, the quest for knowledge, for literacy, in slave narratives that was equated with personhood, citizenship, the ability to escape. That the obstacle in my dream was made of oyster shells, the indigenous materials of my native geography, is also telling. Location, wrote Eudora Welty, is the crossroads of circumstance. Even in the dream, I knew the World Book was there, waiting for me. I needed only to get to it. Thank you.
I was so taken by you made me think about why would any Black parents, why was your mother so insistent on that World Book Encyclopedia? Why did my family buy that for their daughters as well? In that particular moment, the 60s, the 70s, that moment of promise, and what they envisioned for you.
Right. I mean, we come from a generation in a moment in particular where people still believed that the path toward any kind of uplift in this country was through education, was through reading, and that only in reading, despite perhaps the limitations of the place that you came from, the world could be opened up to you, and that world of knowledge.
And even the things we were reading are imperfect. I mean, you talk later about the World Book, and it's very limited ways of talking about race. There are only so many things, even though we might have imagined. I certainly imagined if I read every page in the World Book, I would know a lot. And I would know a lot.
There was a summer that I thought, I'm going to read the whole thing,
right.
And I'm going to teach myself the Greek alphabet. You know, I'm going to.
You were more adventurous than I was not going to teach myself the Greek.
I thought I'm going to become as worldly as possible, and right. This is, you know, this happens in that particular chapter where I somehow land on the entry for races of man, right. And I was stunned at what I found in that section. And it was not only the language, but the visual imagery of that chapter. There was always present a visual hierarchy of races. And this is, you know, I'm reading this page and I come to it and it's Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid. And all of the different kind of phenotypical differences that the editors believed right. were possessed by each of these different races of man. And even when there seemed to be no hierarchy in the language, the visual imagery was suggesting a hierarchy. So, for example, the Caucasoid. The image representing the Caucasoid was a bust carved as if out of Parian marble, that pure white marble, with the head angled as if in contemplation of all the great ideas.
And beautiful.
And beautiful.
Implying beauty.
Beauty, intelligence, all of that. The Negroid specimen, you say I even said it. It looked like a specimen. Absolutely. It was the kind of thing, almost photographic. It reminded me years later of the images that I had seen of Agassiz slave portraits made in South Carolina, and the way that the people stared at the camera glassy-eyed as if they held everything back, behind the lens of their eyes. And they were also talking about ideas of difference that were rooted in physiognomy. And so the editors asserted that in one race, the length of the leg from the hip to the knee was longer than from the knee to the ankle. And that was one of the differences between white and black people. And, I was growing up black and biracial in Mississippi at the time, and that's the moment that I sneak into my grandmother's workroom. She was a drapery seamstress, and pull out a tape measure and measure my leg, because I'm thinking, well, the Encyclopedia has defined for me who I am or what I'm supposed to be. Right. So even before I had learned to push back against it, I knew something was wrong with it, but I hadn't yet escaped it.
Right. One of the interesting things about this book is that, on the one hand, your parents, particularly in terms of writing, your father initially is the one introducing you to metaphor, to the canon, as we call it, the classical canon, which is largely European. And later in the book, you say that some of those structures, those poetic structures that you learned so early on, gave you a place to put a range of complicated feelings. The racial conflicts that you were born to in Mississippi and the nation, your mother's death, and then your own need to finally confront the loss of your mother. And you say at that part of the book that traditional forms serve as not only a container of grief, but also a way to transform it, as well as a means to reinscribe it. And many of these traditional forms, you say, from the sonnets to the villanelle to the blues is part of your tradition as well, can function in this way. But when I think of the classical forms, the World Book, I sometimes feel guilty that I have that foundation. I think about the Audre Lorde quote, and I think a lot of us do, about the master's tools. Can the master's tools destroy the master's house? How do you understand yourself as someone who has all these tools at hand? The canonical, those that many think are not canonical or somehow different. How are we to make sense of the things that we're given, and then, as you said, when you begin to push back, how do you push back?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about those abiding metaphors that I think you've just raised. The second chapter in the book is called Crossroads, and you alluded to that in your introduction. I'm talking about, both literally and figuratively in that chapter, being born into a moment of crossroads in American history, but also the literal crossroads of a road. My grandmother's house, which was the first house I entered the day after I left the hospital in 1966. When I was born in 1966, April 26, it was the 100th anniversary of the South's celebration of Confederate Memorial Day, a holiday glorifying the lost cause, white supremacy, the attempt to destroy the Union in order to maintain slavery. So I was born a biracial child to parents whose marriage was illegal there and in as many as 20 states in the nation. So that was a crossroads. It was a crossroads in American history and a violent crossroads, because I was born just after the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of 1964 and 65. After Freedom Summer, years of racially motivated murders in Mississippi, and I was born and went into that house on a crossroads. So my grandmother's house sat at the crossroads of a highway, Highway 49, which was made famous as one of the blues highways. It supposedly was one of the crossroads between 49 and 61, where Robert Johnson supposedly sold his soul to the devil. So on one side of my grandmother's house, the Blues Highway, Highway 49, and it was the Crossroads. Her house sat on Jefferson Street, named actually for the president, Thomas Jefferson. So I sat at this crossroads of both a vernacular tradition of that road, 49, and the classical tradition and Enlightenment values of Thomas Jefferson. So I was born into all of these different crossroads, and one other is the fact that my grandmother's house was a shotgun house, which is a traditional form that many scholars believe came to us from West African architecture. And so all of the ways that at this crossroads, I was learning two kinds of things, even a crossroads of language. My father, who wanted me at all times to speak what he would have called the King's English, but also the intimate familial language of Black English that I heard my grandmother speak only among people who came over from church to visit, not the way she talked to her customers, she was a drapery seamstress, or the way that I heard my mother speak only in certain moments. So there was a bilingual nature to the language I was also learning. And as my father wanted me to rid myself of Black English, there was no way that I was going to give up the ability to code switch, to speak that other language with its rich metaphors and cadences and idioms. And so what I understood was that having that language as well was a way also to push back against the ways that the King's English, in its figures of speech, was constructing who I was. So this gets me to those traditional forms that you're talking about, and Audre Lorde's idea that the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. I want to just say something about being in graduate school, for example, and needing to tell my own stories, needing to tell the stories of those people in that vanishing community, which had been an enclave of freed Blacks after the Civil War. I wanted to maintain something of that place that was going away. But I can remember having professors that were not interested in me writing about that particular history, who were telling me to unburden myself of being Black and write about something else, the situation in Northern Ireland, as if there weren't enough in the United States situation to write about. And so I think it was at that moment that I leaned heavily on traditional forms, because I thought, you don't like what I want to write about, but if I write this in a sonnet, you will not be able to ignore it. And in that way, I'm going to use your traditional forms to make you acknowledge what else they can contain.
I have to say, this is the way of politics in this nation for African Americans. If you say you're a liberal democracy, then why are we prevented from voting? And of course, we could go on and on. I really appreciate in the book how you talk about your grandmother and the ways that when you say this crossroads, I feel like there's a crossroads in your house, working class, middle class, or upwardly mobile, right? Your parents are college educated, your grandmother is part of this long working class tradition, and you also see that, and those things also certainly inform your poetry, and that's what you write about. And I would love for you to read the part in your book where you talk about your grandmother's artistry. She's a seamstress. She's someone who creates three-dimensional windows onto the world for the blank wall in her home. And that, too, is part of, I think, it's part of where you get your metaphors and your imagery. And so I'd like you to read how about that.
Okay, sure. So, as Leslie said, my grandmother was a drapery seamstress, and her workroom was on one side of this double shotgun house after she'd built onto it. And I spent my summers there with her, and my playroom was just next to it, so I could hear her in her workroom, or I could spend hours in there watching her. Watching my grandmother's craftsmanship, I was learning something about the necessity for precision, how to look for loose or uneven stitches, the just articulation as the designs on patterned fabric, when pieced together, matched seamlessly to the eye. To create that seamless blending of form, she made precise measures and cuts so that no material was wasted, nothing was out of place, the patterns true, the result a thing of beauty. That translates to me now as a way to think about syntax, about order and chaos. How one writes is inseparable from why one does. All those lessons, inadvertently learned in my grandmother's workroom, would come back to me when I began to write, my foot tapping the floor to the rhythm of syntax the way hers tapped the pedal of the singer. What I knew of her life guiding me toward my first collection of poems, domestic work. Her earliest job had been as a domestic, she and her sisters taking in wash, trapping, gutting, and delivering crabs to the back doors of white people's homes, cooking and cleaning. Over her lifetime, each new job she held, from elevator operator to beautician to drapery seamstress in a factory, and finally self-employment, represented her tireless striving. She'd grown up during the Depression, which is perhaps why she seemed always to define herself by the work of her hands. Her stories were filled with the details of the labor she and her siblings had done, not merely for survival in the Jim Crow South, but because of an abiding belief in the nobility of it. They were among the great numbers of the African American working class whose labors helped to build the nation and keep it running. The story of the Negro in America, wrote James Baldwin, is the story of America.
Thank you for that. I don't think I've ever asked you, did your grandmother read domestic work?
Oh, she did.
What did she think of it?
Well, the first thing she said was, "It's all about me." And then she said, "And it's just the way it happened."
Wow.
Even as, of course, I was imagining so much
Sure.
of it, taking from what I knew of her stories, and, as one gives to a sort of a character in one's work, something of the self. Mm-hmm. So she was both a striver, but I suppose that I was too. Mm-hmm. And so that desire for, as one poem ends, a wish for something better, was both hers and mine.
Right. I also think about, you and your parents lived with her for how long? For 5 years? The first 5 years of your life?
A little bit less than that.
A little bit less than that?
Yeah.
A little bit of I guess I wonder, so your father in some ways, was critical of the language, but in other ways, in that early foundational time.
Steeped in it, yeah.
Yes, I'm wondering about what their relationship was like and how he, I don't know, I'm not even sure what I'm asking, so you take it where
They had a long relationship. Mm-hmm. I think they enjoyed each other's company, and mm-hmm. my father, continued to see my grandmother long after he and my mother were divorced, and then even after my mother's death.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
I'm glad to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of us are in families where we have complex views of each other,
right? And
so it's good to hear that they still were connected. Mm-hmm. The title of your book, The House of Being, comes from Martin Heidegger saying, "Language is the house of being." And throughout the book, you talk about problematic figures who have wisdom to share, even as they have enacted terrible damage. Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party. Thomas Jefferson is someone else that you bring up, and you were at the Crossroads in Mississippi. He knew that he was committing an injustice through the enslavement of people of African descent. And you quote him saying, "Among the blacks there is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry." And he claimed this even though he had repeatedly been given proof otherwise. and no less proof from Phyllis Wheatley. So some people build with language houses of lies, and we're certainly in a moment now where we're battling against that. So we have these people, we're forced to both acknowledge the partial truths and enlightenment, if you will, forward, and then hold back and battle against the untruths. And can you talk about how you hold those realities in tension? I think a lot of us, I think about my students. I have students and even colleagues who, when you mention Thomas Jefferson, because he was an enslaver, because of Sally Hemings, they're, off the list, canceled, we're not gonna, And I'm okay, but part of the reason we're here is because of all the bad things and the good things.
And the good things.
And it's really, it's a struggle to sort of live through that. I mean, that is a big crossroads, certainly for every, it should be for every American, but of course it hits, African Americans tend to be, and some groups tend to be more aware of that tension.
I can remember, over the years, all of the conversations that my father and I had about the Enlightenment, for example. And the Enlightenment, we all know, was so good for so many reasons. And yet, it was Enlightenment philosophers who first began to codify ideas of racial difference and hierarchy. But if we throw out everything, it's like it's throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And I think that that's one of the struggles for me with being an early lover of books who believed that they were the repositories of the best ideas and language across time and space, before I began to see that they also contained things that were untruths, that were deeply problematic. And I struggled for a bit with titling this book, The House of Being. My father would quote that to me all the time, because as I mentioned, he really wanted me to have an early understanding in the figurative nature of language, from Robert Frost's idea that if you don't know the metaphor and its strengths or weaknesses, you don't know when to ride with it, when it's going to let you down. You are not safe in science, you are not safe in history. And so he would quote Heidegger, language is the house of being, and of course it is. Children enter the sense-making world through language, through naming things, and all of the metaphors inherent therein. But I thought, as beautiful as that is, as true as it is, how can I title my book, for the people who are going to know that this comes from Heidegger, that I am plucking from Heidegger, this a Nazi, this beautiful title. And I think, though, when I decided to go with it, it is because we have to be able to hold those two things at once, that enduring ideas come from difficult places, and that the enduring ideas, for example, of our own founding documents in this nation, we've had to push back against some of the things that they say because we know that they didn't always include everyone in the language. And so for me, even using that difficult statement is a way of holding the possibility of justice, of saying we can take from this and improve upon it and make something that is just that hasn't been.
I also want to pull out, you say it in the book and you said it here again, Robert Frost, that you can't just accept it without knowing all of it.
Right.
So you understand all of the meanings, and same with our founding documents. We have to understand all of the meanings. And there are people cherry picking in some cases.
Well, I'm sorry, you made me think about this. I wanted to go back to the Thomas Jefferson quote. So, I mean, my father and I talked about Jefferson a lot over the years too, and I'm with you. Like Jefferson, as one of the fathers of our founding documents, did so much for this country's idea of democracy. And yet, in his notes on the state of Virginia, is when he said, among the blacks is misery enough, but God knows, no poetry. Even as he had been presented with the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley, even as he was, presented with all examples of the opposite of what he believed.
Black genius.
But he actually believed, this is something else Jefferson says in Notes on the State of Virginia, he wanted a kind of comparative anatomy. He believed that if doctors were to cut the Negro open, they would be able to ascertain what Jefferson believed to be the root of black inferiority, because he believed that it was a given. And that is a white supremacist notion. And so all of these debates that I had with my father over the years, where my father was equipping me with, as a poet himself, the master's tools of poetry. He was also one of my first professors of poetry. But also the techniques of rhetoric, of debate. My father was also part of the way that I was being equipped with the very things that could dismantle his own ideas of hierarchy and difference.
Did he say, I'm thinking of at the end when the swords people, did he admit that he had been dismantled?
Well, I want to say you're going to have to wait for this next book, which is a memoir about my father called Repentance.
Yes.
But I think that there is a moment that I know I won the argument.
You won the argument.
Yeah.
I can't wait. I can't wait. My last question before we turn it over, you discuss in the book how you came to write about the existential wound of your mother's death. You had written Native Guard, it won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry, and that was about the black soldiers forgotten, left out of the Civil War history, and about the unresolved wound of the Civil War and slavery in this country. And then you realized that you had to move towards repairing your own unresolved wound and directly confront the unresolved within you about your mother's death. And you discuss that series of transitions much more elegantly than I possibly can. How did you decide, though, that Memorial Drive would be a prose piece? And was the process of shaping that book different from the poetry, the acclaimed poetry collections you've written before?
Well, writing prose, writing Memorial Drive was never something that I anticipated doing. And the reason that I turned to prose in that, because I had been writing poetry about my mother, about my grandmother, about those black soldiers, about the Civil War and white supremacy and the Klan. All of those things had already come out in poems. But the part that got to me in the aftermath of winning the Pulitzer Prize and being named Poet Laureate of the United States, more scholars and journalists began to write about me. So it was another moment where my story was being defined by someone else writing about me. And in that, my mother was often mentioned as an afterthought, as a victim, a murdered woman, nothing more than that, as if she played no crucial role in me becoming the person and the poet that I am. And I needed to set the record straight. And I needed a lot more space to move around in so that people could understand, who might not be able to grasp all of it in the compression and density of a poem, where I came from, why I write, the influence she had on me, as well as the influence that my, at the time, still living poet, white father had on me. It's so easy for people to make this assumption that, I'm like Athena, sprung fully formed from the head of the great master, the great white father.
Yes.
But that's not the case.
That's not the case at all. And if people are reading carefully from the very beginning, you are clear that that's not the case. Has writing prose affected how you write poetry?
I would say that how I write poetry affects more how I write prose. There are elements of form and structure that I tend to return to as a poet. One of them is a kind of non-linear advancement, which has to do with circling back to certain kinds of motifs that gather strength and change as you go forward with them. I'm also, as a poet, someone who is very interested in the rhythm of language and syntax. And of course, a poem in lineation also has line breaks and silences and caesura and all the different ways that we make music, because the line is the musical notation in a poem. But that doesn't mean you give up the musical notation of a sentence. And so in writing prose, I don't have line breaks, but I do still have the rhythm of syntax. And I am very focused on writing both lyrical prose that is also as rich in imagery and scene as the poems are, and metaphor.
On the way over, I was speaking with someone in the car about this conversation, and we were saying that it's not unusual for poets to go to prose and inform us, but the other way, for a prose writer to become a poet is quite, it's quite a different challenge, and we couldn't think of anyone. So,
Who went the other way.
Yes, so, well, thank you. We will open it up for questions now from the audience.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming out. We're at the Q&A portion of our program.
Thank you.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll come to you with this microphone. Please keep your input to questions and comments to a minimum and speak clearly and slowly into the microphone. First question, I'm going to come right over to you. All right, our first question is right here.
Hi, thank you both for the conversation and the questions. I'm really intrigued by your idea of enduring ideas coming from difficult places, and I wondered, I think this is maybe to both of you as professors in academia, how in the world today, where sometimes it seems like only particular ideas are sort of given full space, do you I don't know, how do you address this within your classroom and with students to really make fulsome the power of enduring ideas coming from difficult places as opposed to shutting them down?
Well, I think that perhaps I'm lucky because I teach poetry, and poetry is a container that can hold very difficult knowledge. And allow for it. I mean, let me say it like this. When I first went to Washington to take up my post as Poet Laureate, I had to go through this little briefing. And in that briefing, they told me that my predecessor, the late, great Phil Levine, had gotten in trouble with Congress because he'd given an interview in which he said Congress was a den of vipers. And now you know the Poet Laureate position was created by Congress. And you are housed, you're the consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress. And so you don't want to do anything that's going to make Congress shut down that position, the Poet Laureate position. And, poets across time and space have always been dangerous, People have wanted to kick them out of society because they critique and they find ways in language to say very difficult things. And so they told me that I better not make statements like that, but that I could say whatever I wanted as long as I said it in the context of a poem. That is how we make room for difficult things. And sometimes, you know, there are poems right now being written to push back against poems from, you know, another century. You know, we've got to push back against the great poets who were also anti-Semites, for example. You know, you're gonna teach Ezra Pound. Well, teach the whole thing about Ezra Pound.
Similarly, in the history classroom, how I would build on that is that students hopefully take more than one class also. So there are the things that I can contain here, it's in the quarter system, which is even worse, shorter than the semester system in terms of difficult ideas, but also realizing that students are going to traverse many different fields, sets of ideas and things. There's actually, and that we're not only teaching particular things, but we're teaching ways to find out. And so if a student disagrees or wants to investigate something more, I say, well, you've got a library here. You've got librarians. There are more books than I can point to that you could continue your inquiry. And this idea that, you know, the body of knowledge we give them is fixed, and once they have it, they just walk away. My hope is that they continue to ask questions. And I've had students come back and teach me, you know, a few things, or, you know, you've had people read and come back, and that, to me, is much more important than they understood everything I told them. It's much more important that they continue to ask those questions and to research. And it's those tools that I think are really what our universities are about.
Yeah.
There's no way that in a course I could possibly tell them everything, even everything that I, you know, want them to know.
Mm-hmm.
Your next question is over here.
Just to pick up on the last question, which was a great one. Now that you're no longer poet laureate, is there a specific poem, you know, with a powerful message you probably could not have gotten away with just saying without poetry?
Well, I think there are two poems that I think about. One is a very recent poem of mine that I was actually commissioned to write. And I was commissioned to write this poem for the, what was that?
The Tulsa anniversary? Tulsa?
No, not the Tulsa poem.
Oh, the World War I.
No. The thing that you were a reader on, and they didn't take your suggestions. The
1619?
The 1619 Project,
Oops.
right. I was commissioned to write a poem for the 1619 Project.
We didn't really talk
And
about
they gave us each assignments, and my assignment was to write about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And, you know, you're given a topic like that, and it just sounds kind of like dry. It sounds prosaic. How am I going to write about that? And so the way that I wrote about it, a couple of things, you know, I had this archive that my father had given me of all the letters that my mother wrote to him when they were apart and when they were, you know, courting early on. And my mother turned 21 in June of 1965. And so this was just before the Voting Rights Act was signed into law in August. And the voting age at that point was still 21. And there's this fantastic moment in one of the letters where my mother signs off by saying to my father, gotta run, gotta get downtown to register to vote. And the poem is called Quotidian because it is about the sort of quotidian things in our lives, that she thought that going down to register to vote was a right that everyone had as a citizen in this country, and it was quotidian for her to just go down there, sign up, and be ready to do it. Also quotidian in that poem was injustice. So that the poem I'm talking about holds also a photograph from the cover of The Movement, which is a book my grandmother brought home. It's a book of photographs of the civil rights movement, published in 1965. That includes photographs of lynching, where, you know, smiling, happy white revelers are there pointing up at the body, holding hands. That was also quotidian. Injustice was quotidian. On the cover is a black protester who's being choked by a cop. Quotidian. All the quotidian things that we're seeing even now. And the poem begins with an epigraph from Justice Hugo Black, who apparently had been a Klansman, but, you know, when it came to passing the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, he wrote in 1964 that there was no right, you know, more precious in a free country than that of having a voice in the elections that determine the people and the laws under which we all must live. Any other rights, no matter how basic, are illusory if the right to vote is undermined. You see what I'm getting at? I'm saying things about voting. And so the other poem is a poem called Incident, which is about a cross burning in my front yard, my side yard, my grandmother's house, in the 60s, when the church was trying to get black voters registered to vote, and to sort of get over some of that disenfranchisement. We were an interracial family living inside the house, but also my grandmother was letting the church park its bus in her driveway. And so because of this, we never knew if the act of domestic terrorism was directed at the interracial family in the house or the fact that the church was doing a Voting Rights Act. And so when I introduced that poem, I often say, and I said it back then, but I say it even more now, so I hope this is an answer to your question, that we have a lot of trumped up conversations these days about voter fraud, when what we should be talking about is voter suppression, voter intimidation, disenfranchisement. So that is something that maybe Congress would be mad if I said it. I think a lot of them would be. But I'm gonna say it because I'm telling a story about, you know, my own family. I'm telling a story about the history of voting rights and where we stand with undermining them right now.
Your next question is in the center again.
Yeah, thank you. Natasha, you're so generous about attributing your artistic and intellectual development to your parents, but I would like to know what you've done despite your parents.
You need to ask my father. Well, I also, you know, in this book in particular, I'm talking about my grandmother. I mean, because I go back to my grandmother's house. That's where it begins. I mean, the house of being here is a metaphor also for my grandmother's house being that place of first permission. I liken it to, you know, the imagination is the first place of permission, but so is everything that I learned in my grandmother's house. You know, there's something else that Orwell says in his essay, Why I Write, about how early on in a child's development, you will already sort of form the sort of way of seeing the world that will be with you forever. And so I know that probably a lot of that formation had to do with being in that house with those people in that particular place and time. But from there, it is what you read. It is what you make of it. And I think if there's something that I've done that wasn't of my parents' making, well, I mean, I think Well, it's hard to say. Let me say it like this. If I believed that, and I try to cover this in the book too, if I believed that in some ways my father was sort of giving me some of those tools to push back, my mother was too. There were ways that she was also giving me tools to push back. But when I think about the most important thing that I think that I do as a writer, it is best articulated to me in this idea from Yeats: we make of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves poetry. I am willing to take all of the arguments that I have, the necessary arguments that I need to have with my nation, that might only lead to rhetoric, if I wasn't willing also to have those arguments with myself, which is the thing that makes it poetry.
Unfortunately, we're out of time for Q&A.
Natasha, as always, thank you for your generosity and sharing your work and your method and all that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you.